So far in this series, I've shown you a handful of ways to generate geometry. One way, just using primitives and using deformers to kind of mold those primitives into a shape of the object that we want, or by using splines and generating geometry off those splines using generators. In this video, I'm going to introduce you to something called volume modeling, which is one of the most fun and easy ways to model. And we're going to use it to create some coral for our crab's bowl. So just like we created a new project to create our rocks and then copied and pasted them into our original scene file, we're going to do the same thing and break out into a separate project file to create the coral. So what we're going to do is create a new project by just clicking this plus button. And this isn't actually going to save a new project file to our computer. So let's make sure that we're actually saving this new project file. So we're going to go to File, Save Project As. Let's go and rename this coral file. There we go. And now we can begin to work. So just like we started out with a spline to generate our fishbowl using that lathe object, we're going to do a similar workflow. And we're going to start with a spline and basically like stroke the spline with some geometry using the volume modeling method that I mentioned just a minute ago. So let's start out with a spline. So we'll go to our spline menu. And remember we used the spline pen before, and remember how the spline pen works is you can click and drag, you get these Bezier handles, and you can generate a spline, okay? Now I'm not going to use that method because I want to get a little bit more organic and maybe willy-nilly or, freehand a little bit more as far as how I'm drawing those splines. And luckily, there is this sketch tool, which is almost like your Photoshop pen tool where you can, again, just willy-nilly just sketch out some lines, rough and dirty. And so I'm just going to grab that sketch pen and I'm just going to start sketching. And you can see how I'm just kind of sketching things out. And we have these options over here, which the most important option here is the stroke smoothing. So this is just going to try to smooth out the spline that you're actually drawing. So you can see as I kind of draw my splines, this is trying to do its best job to smooth things out and make me look like a better drawer than I am. One thing you will notice is that all of these splines are being generated on a single spline object here. And if you want to create a separate spline for each spline that you're drawing, all you got to do is simply select this Create New Spline, check that on, and then when you create a new spline, you'll see that actually be in its own spline object. So if I go into my model mode here and hit the E key to get the move tool and select this spline, you can see there's the one spline. And then if I click the other spline object, that has all of the other splines that I created previously, okay? So that's basically the rundown for how this sketch pen works. Let's go back into the sketch pen and let's uncheck this Create New Spline because basically I want to just create a bunch of branching splines that we'll then use to then stroke some geometry along and generate our coral, okay? So let's maybe bring down the stroke smoothing to like 73 or something like that. And let's just create the base of our coral. So I'm just gonna maybe come up like this and then break out like that. And you can see this is pretty wobbly because I'm on a Wacom and I guess I had too much coffee today. So I'm gonna try that again and maybe break out like that. And it's still a little bit wobbly, but you know what? We can still edit this spline. And you're not seeing the points on our spline just yet because we're in model mode. If we want to start manipulating points, let's make sure we're in point mode. And now we can hit the E key and start selecting and deleting these points. Or we can go into the spline menu and use the spline smooth tool. And this will smooth out this spline very nicely, okay? Now I can always hit the E key again and maybe flatten out this base of the coral like so, something like this. And I would say this is looking pretty nice. Now always make sure everything's looking good in all of your views, okay? If you need to use your 4-up view, go ahead and do that. You can see how there's this little kink in the coral kink. Let's get rid of that. So something like that. And this is a good base here. Now we can start to create all of the other branching bits here. So let's go back into our sketch tool by going to our previously used tools widget right here. Let's grab the sketch and let's click and drag. And you can see that I missed that. Also, this is kind of floating in Z space. So I want to be able to, draw the spline and have it connect to the existing spline. You can see as I'm just drawing in 3D space, I'm way off the mark. So I'm going to undo that by hitting Command or Control Z a few times. Now, to actually have every spline that I'm going to create actually attach to this existing spline or snap to this existing spline, keyword snap, is to turn on the snapping tool, which we'll remember is right here. So I'm going to click that on, enable snap, and I'm going to go into the snapping settings here. And I'm just going to change one setting, and that is to turn on spline snapping. So I'm going to turn that on. I'm going to click out of this menu, and let's create the first branch, say right about here. So I can orbit around here, and I'm going to click, and you're going to see this little spline snap pop up, which means that, okay, we're snapping to this existing spline, and then I'm just going to draw that little branch. And there you go. There's our little branch there. Maybe we have another branch that's right about here. You can see that's also connected to the spline. And so the corals aren't all branching the same way. I'm going to maybe orbit around this way and create that branch like so. I can undo that. Let's do this again. That's looking good. So now we got a little bit more depth to our branching. So that's looking pretty good. Now let's have maybe a branch out like here. And then we'll branch out maybe like this. So that's branching out forward, as you can see. And maybe branch like this, and we'll see what that looks like when we actually, apply a stroke of polygons to this. Okay, so again, we only have just the spline here. If I hit the render button, which is right here, to render our viewport, you're going to see nothing renders, because just like nothing's going to render out if you just have paths in After Effects, nothing's going to render out in Cinema 4D if you just have a spline. So I'm just going to hit escape to bring back my non-rendered view of my viewport. And we're going to generate geometry off this spline. And how we're going to do that is called volume modeling. So let's just kind of walk through what that means. So what I'm going to do to generate a volume is to go into our volume menu here. Okay, so I'm going to click and hold. And you're going to see we have a volume builder and a volume mesher. So how this method works is we're going to build the volume first, and then we're going to create a mesh based on that volume. Okay, so that's a little bit of how this workflow is going to go. So let's create the volume builder. And remember, this is green, so that means it's a generator object. So it's going to generate geometry off of any children object we feed into it. So if I click and drag and make this spline a child of this volume builder, you'll see, great, a bunch of like 3D pixels here. So what you're seeing here is called voxels. And if I go to my model menu, hit the E key to get my move tool, and just select this volume builder here, you're going to see that basically this is generating voxels, which are 3D pixels. Here's your voxel size. So if we decrease the voxel size here, we're actually getting smaller pixels, and we're actually increasing the resolution of our volume. Just like if you had smaller pixels on an image, you would increase the resolution on an actual, Photoshop file or an image like that. And you can see that now it looks kind of like a deformed Michelin Man or something like that. And really what's happening is it's just a bunch of voxeled spheres kind of being cloned along the spline here. So you can see our spline is in our volume builder menu, which means that it's creating a volume based on this object here. You can have multiple objects in here as well. You can have primitive objects, wherever you want, and it's going to generate a volume based off of it. But you can see with our spline, we have these other settings here, which number one is the radius. So these are the radius of those spheres. And then we have this density, which will either lower or increase the density of those spheres. And if we increase the density enough, this looks like we're actually kind of stroking our spline with voxels. Now you can see once we actually have a bunch of voxels here, you're seeing a little bit of like, it almost looks like a thumbs bending or something like that. So we can always go back into our original spline, turn off the volume builder here by clicking that checkbox to an X, and going into our point mode and getting out of our snap tool here and just selecting some points and deleting them, okay? And we can even go back into our spline smooth tool as well and just kind of smooth some of these out. Okay, something like this. You don't want to smooth them out too much, but something like that is looking nice. Let's turn back on our volume builder, and this is looking a lot nicer, okay? So let's go ahead, and again, we are just having voxels. Voxels do not render. You can see if I click the render view, you're gonna see nothing still because we haven't generated any geometry based off of these voxels. So to do that, we're gonna go back into that volume builder menu and grab a volume mesher this time. And so to create a mesh off of the volume builder, again, this is a generator, we're going to drag and drop this volume builder as a child of the volume mesher. And now we actually render, and this is actual geometry being generated here. If I hit NB, you can see pretty dense mesh here, a lot of polygons here, pretty dense mesh. So I'm going to hit NA to go back to our garage shading without lines. And you can see that, it's looking okay. You can see the seams here. It almost looks like this is welded together. So luckily we can actually go into our volume builder here and smooth out our voxels. So I'm just going to create a SDF smooth. And how the SDF smooth works is it's almost like an adjustment layer in After Effects, where as long as it's on the top, it's going to affect all of the layers underneath it. If I take this and move this below the spline, you're going to see it's actually not affecting it anymore. So we'll place that back above that spline. And here we have the strength here, the voxel distance, the iterations here. And you can think of this as like a Gaussian blur for your voxels. You're blurring your voxels, blurring your 3D pixels together to smooth everything out, to smooth out that volume. And this is looking pretty nice, okay? And if I hit NB to get back into our garage shading with lines, you can see how dense this mesh is. And remember how we used that remesh to lower the mesh density of our rocks? We can do the same thing here as well. So what we're gonna do is go into our other generator menu here and grab a remesh. And we're just gonna feed this volume mesher, make it a child of that remesh, click on the remesh object here, and let's just turn down that mesh density to, let's call it 19. And you'll see that we have a lot less polygons here, and the fidelity is pretty nice. If I get out of my garage shading with lines by hitting NA, you can see this looks still pretty smooth, and we have a lot less polygons than we did before. We can even see how low we can go and still have a pretty nice mesh. And I'm thinking 15% looks pretty good. And we can see what that looked like without the remesh, just how many polygons were there. And then we just lowered that amount and still looking really nice. So I'll hit NB to get back to our original shading. And this is looking really nice. And again, we could always go back into our spline, turn off all of these options here by clicking and dragging, changing all those checkboxes to X's, and doing whatever kind of edit we want. We can even select a single branch here, and it's kind of a pain to select all of these bits of this single spline, but an easy way to grow the selection out and to select all of your spline is to hit U, and this is going to bring up a bunch of modeling commands or selection commands. And I'm just going to hit U and then Y to grow selection. So if you see at the very bottom of this list, Y is grow selection, so I'll hit Y. And I'll do this multiple times, and you'll see I just selected all the points on that spline. And now I can kind of rotate this around. I can even select this other spline here, and I can do this a different way. I can hit 0 to get my rectangular selection, hold the Shift key down, and select the rest of those points there. Hit the E key, and maybe I want to shrink this or scale this up, and just need to reattach this to this main spline here. And this is where going to my 4-up view is really going to help, and just make sure that we're looking good in all angles here. We don't really have to be too precise either. We just got to get close enough, because after all, we are meshing this. So even if I move this spline all the way over here and rotate, we're still connecting with that mesh. Even though if I turn all this off, we're pretty far from that main spline. So all that's to say is you have a lot of flexibility with this volume mesher, this volume builder. So this is looking good. So let's go ahead and bake this down to an actual polygon object that won't have all of this calculation going on constantly in our viewport. So we're going to do that by selecting this topmost object, which is the remesh. We're going to go right click, and we're going to go down to current state to object. And that's going to create a polygon object, which if I go into model mode here, I can move this out of the way, and voila, there is our coral. So let's rename this coral. And let's say we want to make another iteration of that coral. So we can either go and adjust this spline, or I can delete this spline altogether and generate a whole new spline. So let's go back into our sketch pen, and let's just go all willy-nilly like. Let's turn on spline snapping again. Let's create this spline like that, have a little nubbin right there. Let's branch out over here. Again, we want to make sure we're changing the angle, so you can see how flat that spline is. Let's make this a little bit more 3D and just change the angle here. So we got that a little forward. Maybe we got that branching out here. Maybe we got a branch coming down like this and like that. And let's see, drum roll, what this looks like if we place this spline as a child of that volume builder. And you can see hey, that doesn't look the same as this. And that's because if we go into our volume builder, number one, we have a brand new spline object that we added, and it got applied to the top of this stack. So first we need to make sure this is below that smooth layer. So this is going to apply that smooth, but you can just see the smoothed everything out into oblivion. And that's because the spline settings went kind of back to their default. So the radius is super small. Just crank that up. And you can see that, okay, this is, I mean, it's not looking as good as this one, so we might have to tweak this a little bit. But let's just, for the sake of demonstration, say this is done. Let's go ahead and just right-click on the remesh and go to current state to object, and we'll rename this Coral 2. Make sure we're in model mode, just move that out of the way. And now if we wanted to, we could just save this base file. And this is almost like our coral generator C4D file that we can always come back to and come back and generate however many pieces of coral that we want. Okay, so to copy these into our main project, I'm just gonna select both of them, Command and Control C, go to my other project tab here, Command and Control V, and there are our coral that we can, in the next video, start to actually place inside of our fishbowl. So volume modeling really makes the ability to model accessible to so many people who, like myself, would have otherwise not known how to actually model an object like that using traditional modeling methods. So this is definitely a feature we could spend like an entire course on. So be sure to experiment and dive deeper on your own.